I'm going to kick off with one question, because I think the common thread between at least each of your three presentations, also the fourth one where the speaker was unfortunately not here, is about working with nature. And that's done quite differently. But each of those three schemes, nature is very much at the centre of the urban experience, if one can put it like that. And I suppose this is really to turn this. Could I ask each of you, starting Lawrence and Hannah, and then Vicente, and then Alexandra, what did you take from the other presentations, if anything? I mean, did you feel that you could go back to look at Downsview, having seen what Alexandra and Vicente have said, and possibly tweak it in some way?
Absolutely. I think this has been a really wonderful set of projects that are talking to each other in a really lovely way. I mean, I was struck, I think, most by your diagrams of the grid and the branching systems, and the way that we kind of drew that dynamic out of the existing Toronto kind of organization and urban fabric, and tried to make a microcosm of that on the site. And so I think I certainly have learned a lot from thinking through those dynamics and the way that you've, in a very different kind of formal way, been working with the same ideas. And then similarly, like we love to say that the Downsview project is led by landscape, and that idea of bringing our kind of ravine ecologies up onto the site and then using them to structure in a linear, connective, biodiverse way. And I think the richness and depth of what you've done in the Sea Park has been great.
Yeah, I would say that I think all the projects we have seen are fantastic. About your projects, I am very much interested about this idea of how to reuse an obsolete 20th century infrastructure, no? That is this airport, and then you need to find an identity in a place that it never had, but then you try also to connect what you are doing with the existing urban structures and natural network, and to create this, I would say, urban scale that it will be similar to ours, no? This walkable city, human scale, mixed use, and so on. No? And about your project, I like very much the idea that, we have a nature that we don't realize that is a nature, because outside of a big city, no, it's a kind of nature that could be imbibed by the city, but then part of what we need to do is to protect it. And then I like very much the diagram that you show about the biodiversity, etc., because architects, we have been very much focused on the digital technologies, digital revolution, starting 20 years ago. But right now it's very clear that there is a shift on trying to work with ecologists, biologists, etc., and to use this information as part of our project. No, we work for the humans, but we work also for all the species, and then the analysis about the biodiversity that you have presented is great.
Thank you. Well, I'd have to say there were a lot of similarities. I think there's just a wave of transformation, really, amongst all of us involved in design, that we now understand in a much richer way how we have to so closely work with nature to really make the change that we need to see happening. And so it was really lovely to see that in all the projects today. I think both of your projects are slightly more urban and dense. I think our project, it's a peri-urban environment, so the scale of things is rather different. But what I loved about both of your presentations is that it showed how clearly nature can permeate into urban areas. And I think so often in urban design and in master planning, it's been thought that there's sort of this spectrum between urban to natural places, and that if it's urban, it can't also be natural. But yet these are our habitats. These are our human habitats. And so they do need to be so completely integrated. And it's wonderful to see both of your approaches different. But I think what I really appreciated the most is to see how it's communicated in a different way. So a lot of the ideas that we express, that are the same, when we verbally communicate it might be the same, but then to visually back it up provides a whole other level of richness, and to see how both of you approach that was really exciting. So,
Patrick, would you like to make a comment?
Yeah, absolutely, Jeremy. Yeah, first of all, I think a warm welcome and welcome to WAF. And from the Grohe perspective here as a founding partner, since I would say years together with WAF, and again promoting I think this beautiful and creative minds here to be here and talking about our future, the future of our planet, the future of like this interplay between again the community and the space, about the environment, and it is just, I would say, mind-blowing to see these projects here that were presented today. And one thing that's very important for us from a manufacturing point of view, it's the relevance, of course, that this is going to have. And for us, it's interesting to see how society is evolving, right? So how we are moving ahead. One thing that's very clear for us here is about, and I think the 4 projects that we say, I think is about integrating nature in kind of something that we, on the 20s and 30s, decided to start, I would say devastating and destroying and creating concrete, and then afterwards we're integrating nature into a square, which is kind of a completely contrast. Nature is not linear, nature is not geometric, right? Is one thing that you, I think, beautifully explained here in the forest city into it. So we don't have, I would say geometric lines into it in the fractals, and I think is the idea for us to create this kind of I would say pods and growing and integrating into it is just I would say a beautiful way that we can think about this. Also, another thing is about leveraging the existing assets that we have. Leveraging means, leveraging the natural resources, adapting them in the best possible way. We know that we have water, for example, in an abundance, but is not ready for consumption or not ready for use. That's why creating systems of management, as I would say the majority of yours here propose, is just kind of something to really kind of be considered together with energy management also into I think all the urban planning together. Also, one thing that the Toronto city was amazing was that, again, you have the park and you have already an existing I would say urban landmark already created. So instead of rebuilding that, no, let's repurpose the use of that. Again, we're talking about saving a lot in terms of construction, saving a lot in terms of CO2 emissions. That we know that new buildings, again, like 40% of CO2 emissions, a lot about those new buildings. And then this way you are reintegrating, bringing that all together. And I think this is just a tremendous, achievement that I think these projects are having for our future.
Thanks. This is a point for anyone in the audience to ask questions or make comments if you want to. Stick your hand up and I'll try and bring you in. But before we do that, if you're thinking of questions to ask, there's a point that Alexandra and Vincenzo were making, which is about the sort of strange status of Essex. And you were hinting at it being a rural area, which it obviously is, but it is so defined by its relationship with London, with what was 100 years ago the biggest city in the world and is still pretty big. And that all the opportunity, indeed the problems that you're diagnosing originate from London. And the opportunities that piece of land offers are also about serving London, creating a completely new urban-rural partnership. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that.
Sure. Well, it does have a very interesting history, and it sounds like you're familiar with it. Whereas Essex was, for many years, considered London's dumping ground. And it actually is still where much of London's waste ends up. And so these activities have actually caused huge destruction all amongst the marshlands. So originally there were 30,000 hectares of marshland that edged the whole coastline and acted as a protective cushion, accepting all the storm surges, any sea level rises, that sort of activity, and the marshlands were then able to absorb that and protect the land. But over time, we've converted much of that into farmland. We've filled it with our waste. So there's a huge amount of landfills. Some are actually visible from space. They're so big. But anyway, a lot of this now is being restored. And so many of those landfills are now becoming nature sites. Some of the farmland will be restored back to marshland. And as you say, it still is, although it's also in the service of Essex, it will only help to protect London too. So for London to be aware of these issues and understanding and working with Essex and all of the Thames estuary is so important to London's long-term health. At the moment, the Environment Agency is looking to build another barrier because they're expecting these storm surges and sea level rise quite soon, in the imminent future. And but many other things also need to be done at the same time to help protect London and all of those communities.
Good. And I think really coming back to your project, Lawrence and Sahana, which is, as again Vincenzo said, it's about retrofitting a piece of 20th century infrastructure. And I wonder if you can say a little bit more about how that came about. That was obviously a government or possibly a city council decision to build an airport there. But then how the suburban creep enfolded it, which is sort of happening a bit with Heathrow and has happened with other cities in airports in big cities.
Yeah, so that I think, as I mentioned, the airport was originally built in farmland. The city hadn't gotten out there yet, and so the urban grid and the urban systems weren't defining the spatial relationships yet. And so the airfield was sited at a high point between the two watersheds of Toronto. It was oriented to align with prevailing winds, help airplanes take off and land. And so then when the city kind of enfolded it, engulfed it, it became this disruptive presence in the city's fabric, and it's disconnected major streets and it's diverted others and created this real barrier in the city. And so the opportunity, once the airport, it's always been a private airport, mostly for testing of commercial aircraft. And once that's been decommissioned, there's this real opportunity to sort of both capitalize on those differences from the typical city geometries, to invite more sun into the blocks, to mitigate winds, but then also to reconnect this site with the rest of the surroundings.
Good. Thanks. Vincenzo, I think your project is fascinating, but I wonder, are you designing for a particular site in Gabon, or is it something that is a generic strategy for making a city in a tropical rainforest?
Well, in one hand, we have an original commission coming from the government, because what happened is at some point, $300 million of timber disappeared from the country. And then the president removed the vice president and 4 ministers because there was a kind of corruption related with the foreign nature relation, etc. So they asked us to prepare a proposal because he had an important speech in front of the United Nations, and we were working with local developers. And they did propose us a site for the north of Libreville, that this is what I mentioned. So this is a real place that we can found in the northern part of Libreville. But in any case, it's true that what we have been thinking is how to create a new role model about how to make cities, because what we see in other countries, we are building now a school in Cameroon, also with timber, is very similar situation. I think that you mentioned before that in the 20th century, in the Bauhaus, if you remember, we start to build with concrete, we start to use cars, we start to use the urban segregation. This is what is destroying the world. And then somehow we need to define a new role model about how not only to introduce nature in our projects, but how to make cities that are part of the natural systems. And this is what we do. We transform the nature and we give another form that is the form of a city. And then, yes, it has a specific site, but our idea is to try also and we are in a process of dialogue with others about the timber industry in order to develop this kind of development for Africa.
No, I think it's extremely interesting how you're creating a new model of a city, which of course works in the rainforest, and you would do something different if you're working in a desert or any other sort of environment. And I think that point of working with nature is so important. But does anyone have a question? Does anyone want to? We've got some of the most, I think, creative thinkers about the future of cities sitting here. Yes, Rebecca, do we have a microphone?
It works here.
Yeah.
So my question is, we see all these projects working with nature, but at the same time, projects like this are working with the society there, with the local economy. So I was wondering, because this project is unlike the others where it actually creates a city from zero, right? So it's not regenerating a part of it. So how does the city start? What is the evolution of the city? Where does it start from? Where does it end? How do we start? What's the role of the wood industry in actually creating the city and making it move ahead? And how does that affect the local economy in terms of who will work there, who will live there, and all these things.
Yeah, I think, well, your case, the project is more like a park and also a strategy of protection, what I think is absolutely necessary in our cities. But I think that both our projects are starting from nowhere, from something that is not urban, no? And I would say in our case, as I explained at the beginning, there is a huge process of urbanization in Africa, and then many people, the population is growing, and it's obvious that we need to have more houses that we will like not to do like in the 20th century, no? But who will be the people living there?
Yeah, I think for Downsview, as Lawrence was mentioning, the fabric that's warped around the existing airport, one side is a poorer community, and the other side is, a more well-off community. But what was really important with it this time around with the Downsview redevelopment was all of the community consultation that we did, because it was extremely important to hear the voices of the communities, especially those that are underserved and do not have access to nature, as many open spaces. We saw a lot of the effects during COVID. There were higher cases in those areas because there was less access to open space. So we worked with two really great companies that were the voices of the community, and allowed us to really hear what folks had to say about what they wanted to see in their city. And that's what allowed us to give it this richness that we probably wouldn't have been able to bring just ourselves as the design team.
Thank you. And I'm afraid we're going to have to bring this to a close, but that's a very good note. Thank you for finishing, because it introduces the next session we're going to have here, which will start in 20 minutes' time, which is about habitat community. And I think each of these projects could have been talking about community almost as well as environment. It's just that each of them had a very clear environmental message. And the projects we're going to see later this morning have a very clear community message. But I think there'll be similar overlaps. But thank you very much to each of our speakers for presenting our project. And please don't forget our friends from China who couldn't be here. Thank you.